Test, test, test.
Test. That's not working, is it? Test.
If you could all take your seats, please. We're going to start the program here shortly.
Test. Welcome. We are going by public transit rules, so students, if you see someone who might need a seat and you don't mind sitting, please do that. I'm Peter Hartleb, the pop culture critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, Cal Poly journalism from 1988 to 1993. But in journalism years, this was my first cell phone as a working journalist years old. I know you can see it in the back. It's as big as a toaster. On behalf of Cal Poly Journalism Department, welcome to the third Jim Hayes Symposium. And special thanks tonight to symposium sponsor Sage Publishing. One last thank you. Oh, clap for Sage Publishing. Most important thing I'm going to say today, bathrooms out this door and to the left and then immediate right. Okay, that door. I went to journalism school at Cal Poly in the 1990s filled with fears, but they were tangible fears. Will I get an interview with Chuck D from Public Enemy? Will he like me? If he does like me and we become best friends, will that become an ethical issue? Will I get the Telegram Tribune internship? Will the Telegram Tribune hire me when I'm done? Will I make enough money to buy a decent car? Will I ever get back to a big city newspaper near my hometown? 24 years into my career as a journalist, I miss those tangible fears. A Pew Research study released this summer stated what we all knew. Newsroom employment declined 25% between 2008 and 2018, and 45% specifically at newspapers. That's a loss of 27,000 jobs. But it's not just a job loss, it's the loss of control. We live in an era where content is easily shaped and driven by newsmakers themselves, where tech companies with mysterious algorithms, not our circulation departments, control news distribution, where the media itself is often driven into the narrative. Does journalism need to be fixed, or are we in a time of unstoppable change? For most of my career, the advice that I gave younger journalists facing strife in their job was to act like a surfer that got wrecked in a wave, getting spun around and with that barrel foam crashing around you. I tell them when you have a bad boss or an assignment you don't like, or there's a new expense report system that doesn't make sense, don't struggle. Don't waste any oxygen on things you can't control. Just relax your body, wait for it to pass, and you'll pop up on the other side. That's not my advice in 2018. In the time of the greatest changes for journalism since the Gutenberg press was invented, we need to voice opinion. We need to be heard. We need to defend our values when we're attacked. We need to value the reader, listen to them, and make them part of the conversation. We need to struggle and fail and struggle again. And we can't be passive about the future because, like it or not, we're going to be the ones making it. Now, that doesn't have to be bad news. I think often about a profile I wrote about Stuart Brand. He started the Whole Earth catalog. He was a hippie, dropped acid with the Merry Pranksters, and now he's a futurist, looking at where we're going to be in the next 10, 20, 100 years. We didn't become best friends. I'm going to tell you that. I think he follows me on Twitter. But I asked him about climate change, expecting this apocalyptic report. And he gave me exactly that. But he added something as well. He talked about mankind's ability to act heroically in a crisis. He said if we face our toughest challenges together and we're all pointed in the same direction in the face of an adversary and end up beating it, it could be like the end of World War II, a triumph that could lift humanity. I think about that when I think about the challenges ahead of us as journalists. How hard it's going to be, but also how good it's going to feel, how fulfilling if at the end of my career I can look back and know I was part of a good fight that changed the industry. Is journalism broken? That's our subject tonight. But I hope people don't see it as a complaint, but a call to action. If you're a young journalist, your energy and innovation will be needed. And if you're a century or more into your career, you've come this far. Go a little further. And if you're a reader, please keep subscribing. There are good people on the job. You're going to meet a few of them tonight. Thank you. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to send love to the Hayes family. The Jim Hayes Symposium is named after one of Cal Poly's greatest professors. I spoke with him in his final years and once in his final weeks before he died in 2014. And until the end, this type of thing that we're doing tonight is the type of thing he loved to talk about. Solving the problems of journalism over breakfast at the Del Monte Cafe. Jim Hayes would listen, and he was always interested in new directions, and always with the trust that there would be good journalists coming out of places like Cal Poly, and the flame would be carried forward. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kevin Riggs, a proud Cal Poly graduate and Emmy Award-winning political journalist. He worked in the Santa Barbara and Fresno markets, and then at Sacramento NBC affiliate KCRA-TV from 1994 to 2011. Kevin covered the Oklahoma City bombing, the 2000 Florida presidential ballot standoff, and the recall that led to Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor. Now he's the senior vice president of Randall Communications, working in communications and consulting in the Sacramento area. My friend Kevin Riggs.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that kind introduction and for framing the discussion tonight as we embark on a really important conversation, taking a look at the state of journalism today, professionally, politically, and socially. And so I am just delighted at this point to honor a top-notch list of media professionals who make up our panel tonight. I want to go ahead and introduce them now. Let's hold our applause until I've introduced the entire group, and then we will welcome them as is appropriate. So, if the panelists can come up and take their seats on the stage, they include Cindy Carcamo, who covers immigration issues for the Los Angeles Times. Previously, she was Arizona bureau chief and a national correspondent for the Times, focusing on border and immigration issues in the Southwest. She's a native of Los Angeles. She's reported from Mexico, Central America, and South America for the Times, the Orange County Register, and during her time as an Inter-American Press Association scholar. Most recently, she reported from Honduras while covering the Central American exodus. She graduated in 2000 with a journalism degree here at Cal Poly. Martin Reynolds is the director of Reveal Investigative Fellowships. He is also a senior fellow for strategic planning at the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. Reynolds is the co-founder of Oakland Voices, a community storytelling project that trains residents to serve as community correspondents. Prior to his fellowship, he was senior editor for community engagement and training for Bay Area News Group and served as editor-in-chief of the Oakland Tribune from 2008 to 2011. He was also a lead editor on the Chauncey Bailey Project, formed in 2007 to investigate the slaying of the former Oakland Post editor and Tribune reporter. Also joining us tonight, Jan Schaefer. She is executive director of JLab. She has run two of the nation's most successful incubators for news innovations and was recently appointed to a 3-year term as the ombudsman for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. A Pulitzer Prize winner for the Philadelphia Inquirer, Schaefer left daily journalism to lead pioneering initiatives in civic, interactive, and entrepreneurial journalism. She teaches about those efforts at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism and American University's School of Communications. David Rothschild is an economist at Microsoft Research in New York City. He holds a PhD in applied economics from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, his primary body of work is on forecasting and understanding public interest and sentiment. His related work examines how the public absorbs information. He writes extensively in both the academic and popular press on polling, prediction markets, social media, and online data. Since joining Microsoft in 2012, he has been building prediction and sentiment models and organizing novel experimental polling and prediction games. We also have Lauren Williams. Lauren is the editor-in-chief of Vox, where she was previously the executive editor and managing editor. She began her career as a local newspaper reporter for the Daily Press in Newport News, Virginia, and worked in a variety of journalism jobs, from tiny startups to massive internet companies to venerable print publications. Prior to joining Vox, she was most recently an editor at Mother Jones and deputy editor of The Root. So let's put our hands together and welcome our panelists. So we're going to begin tonight with this key question that the forum is all about: is journalism broken? And what I want to do to kind of frame this or set the stage is tell a quick anecdote. And this happened to me actually earlier this week in Sacramento. I think it sort of speaks volumes about where we are in journalism today. I had attended an Asian American Journalists Association fundraiser in Sacramento, and a woman in the parking lot saw me, and she pulled her car up and stopped, and she said, "I recognize you from the TV." And I said, "Hi there," and she says, "Go Trump." And I was a bit startled, and I said, "Okay." And she said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't share my opinions on things like that." She said, "Well, you could." And I said, "Well, I'm just not going to do it." And then she paused for a moment, and she said, "You know, at least you're on the local news. You're not one of those fake news people." And again, it spoke volumes to me about just the status of journalism today, as people wonder who to trust, and people have made up their minds one way or the other. So with that in mind, let me start by asking, and without getting overtly political, and I want all the panelists to address this, how has coverage of the Trump administration affected the way media is looked at today, and is media doing something wrong? Martin, let's start with you.
Hello.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, that's thank you for that nice starting point. You know, it's a hard question. I mean, I think what the Trump administration and caused us to all realize as journalists was we were sort of tiptoeing around falsehoods versus lies. It required journalists to all of a sudden, I think, go from baby teeth that I think that we have been keeping in our mouths for quite some time to being a little more assertive in our, finally, proclamations of complete and out inaccuracies. And I think for some journalists, myself included, I've just like you, when someone would say how you feel about your political views, I always really sought to sort of minimize, wouldn't really go into that, but there's a couple points on this. One is that consumers know we have an opinion. And I think us not sharing our opinion to a certain extent erodes our credibility. Now that's a more challenging conversation, but I think it actually is quite relevant in this new ecosystem. But the other part is that it's something based on the preponderance of evidence. I think it is fair to say that Donald Trump is not fit to be president of the United States. That's not my, wait a minute, that's not my opinion based on how I feel. It's based on an execution or showing of the evidence in his approach to our democracy, the institutions that support it, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not me coming out stating some sort of opinion based on my feelings, my politics. It's based on my view as a journalist, as based on data, based on the reporting that many of my colleagues have across this nation have been putting forth. But that can be, as evidenced by an outburst, a potentially divisive comment, right, on the part of a media professional to articulate. But I think it's important for us to speak on what we have learned based on the reporting and the actions that we have seen. And that can be challenging. It can be upsetting, especially at a time when it's controversial, that people have very strong feelings about things. And it doesn't mean that their feelings are wrong. It just means that that's a perspective based on information, data that I have gleaned as a journalist and what I've seen. So it's challenging.
Jan?
I think that the Trump administration has presented journalism with some of the greatest challenges that we have faced probably in our entire career. At the same time that I think we've had some of the best journalism ever, investigative journalism done, looking into what's been happening in both this administration and with this president. I think the challenges really circle around three main areas. Among them are what is our news judgment role? Are we just a stenographer or not? I think we are caught in a cycle of, well, if the president says it, we must report it. And I think that as we report it, we are giving a megaphone to a lot of misinformation and false information, and actually we are being a megaphone for fake news in a lot of instances. And nobody has quite figured out whether we can put it on page 3A instead of page 1 if you're a print publication. But what should we do with all of this? Does everything have to be reported? I think that we are, the questions of false equivalency continue to challenge us. If we report one side, we have to think of reporting the other side. And I think we don't end up with a balanced story. I think we end up with very bipolar coverage throughout our coverage. And I think that we have very much allowed ourselves to be played, and you might even say weaponized, in the political warfare that is going on, because we have very much allowed Trump to command every news cycle whenever he wants to. If he just says something outrageous, we go on autopilot and we automatically echo whatever outrageous thing he says. And if he needs to deflect attention from something he doesn't like, he'll say something outrageous, and he very much succeeds in deflecting that attention. So I don't think we have quite figured out how we need to behave in all of this. And I think that we very much do need to figure out how to behave, because in many ways we're not only reporting the problem, we are a part of the problem.
I agree with what Jan was saying, and that this administration has brought out some amazing journalism, some of the best reporting and investigations, and so to say that it's broken is not. I don't think that's telling the whole story of what's happening. But what I do think is happening is there's a reckoning. This administration has caused our industry to sort of rethink some of the things that we have taken for granted are just the way things are. And it doesn't feel good in the moment, but maybe it's in some ways a good thing that it's happening, that we were confronting this problem head on, and that we have to find solutions for it. Otherwise, we were just going to sort of perpetuate some of the problematic ways of approaching this business and approaching journalism that have been going on for decades.
Does this work? Yeah.
It does.
So I come at this, I'm a staff writer at the LA Times, but I focus in on immigration issues. And I've been covering immigration for about a decade now. And I guess I could say that I feel like this kind of reckoning that you're talking about and this pent-up anger that the American people feel has been around for quite some time. And I've experienced it because I'm at the receiving end of it. Covering immigration issues as a person of color has been very challenging. You get these nasty, horrible emails from people. And, I feel like when Trump came about and his rise to power, it really wasn't all that surprising to me, because he spoke to a certain sort of person, a certain constituent, that has felt disenfranchised, that has felt like they're not part of American society. And I feel like I've seen this coming for quite some time. I think our responsibility as journalists, and what I've always tried to do in my immigration coverage, is to try to dispel the myths, in particular about immigration. I mean, this happens a lot, especially under the Trump administration, where they will just say, he will say, and his administration will give flat out lies. I can give you an example of saying that there is an immigration crisis at the border, making it seem like we're being inundated by people who are coming to our borders illegally, and actually immigration is at a historical low. So I think it's incumbent for us in the media to call out these falsehoods. And that's very challenging to do right now, and when we're at a point in the industry, in the journalism industry, where I feel frankly that there aren't enough people covering important issues such as immigration, and don't have that institutional knowledge and are able to give that kind of context and perspective. So we definitely, I wouldn't say that journalism is broken, but I would say that it's definitely challenged, and it's really going to, we are at a time of reckoning. I love how you said that, because it really is, and I really think that this is going to change the trajectory of where we go as an industry.
So you brought up post-Trump. It's hard not to look back just slightly earlier to right before in 2016 during the election cycle and what that teed up. And Jan brought up false equivalency. And so for those of you who don't think too much about it, this is something that's generated, and as you were saying, for years, this idea that objectivity in the media was generated by equally showing both sides. And there was not enough, and I think the more people have looked in this more recently, to understand that when you show both sides of the story, you're not actually educating people very well. What you are doing is validating both sides to those people who already have those preconceived notions. So if you provide both sides of the story and somebody has an opinion on one side and someone has an opinion on the other side, you are basically just speaking to that, and you are not providing people with a good education and learning. You are not providing people with a really ability to get challenged by providing objectivity. And one of the things that's been amazing and a kind of growth in the media industry is the split that you've seen post-election, where more people have fought for doing objectivity versus false equivalency. And that's been a good sign when it comes to what the media could possibly do to start educating people in a way that they weren't beforehand. Because if you look at a lot of polling and a lot of data on what people know and didn't know about the election, it's just in politics in general, but also just basic facts about our democracy and public policy. It's incredible how little people understand, and a lot of that has to do with the way in which we were teeing things up, and hopefully some of that will change post-election.
And that was a part of the article that you wrote last year for Columbia Journalism Review, co-wrote, in which you concluded that a lot of the mistrust that the media faces today is in part self-inflicted because of editorial decisions that are made about not just covering Trump, but that was a big factor, obviously, in 2016. Elaborate on that. What did you mean by that? How much of it is self-inflicted?
So the larger question is the state of media, and it's vulnerable right now in both the financial state and whether or not it's doing its kind of larger meta job of teaching things to people. During the 2016 election, if you took a look at the coverage, what you see, if you break down, is mainly coverage of horse race and scandal. The New York Times, kind of the granddaddy of kind of intellectualism, was guilty of having 10 front-page articles on Hillary Clinton's IT scandals in a 6-day period from October 29th to November 3rd. During the entire election cycle from September 1st through Election Day, they had 10 front-page articles that could have generously been prescribed to have any public policy implication at all. So, they're just not talking about these things, and if people don't know what's going on about what would happen with immigration or with healthcare after an election, it's hard to blame the public who is even reading the more intellectual newspapers, let alone the fact that sometimes journalists forget that the vast majority of the American population doesn't even read news, and so that's a kind of green space of people that they can be expanding out into. And so, yeah, there was a lot post-election about what the role of social media was, what the role of fake news was, and a lot of it should be more introspective about what was the role of the mainstream media, what were they covering, what were they not covering. The moment of the election that most stands out to me is Matt Lauer's interview on the aircraft carrier, and I don't know if many of you remember this. And the reason why it was so stark for me is that he spent 30 minutes grilling Hillary Clinton on her IT security, and then spent 30 minutes, I would say, being very gentle with Donald Trump, simply because he didn't feel like he could go to him at depth, and then not correcting incorrect statements that was coming from the presidential candidate. And why that was so chilling to me and so concerning is because a lot of people get their news from those 5-minute clips on the Today Show. You know, if you look at web traffic, you'll see that the vast majority of it is other things than news. But people still look at TV in the morning, they still watch the evening news, and it had degraded into something that really wasn't useful as far as explaining the impact of the upcoming election.
This conversation tonight is not meant to focus, obviously, just on the White House, but I do have one other Trump-related question, then we can hopefully move on. I have to ask you about the president's use of Twitter and social media to label the media as fake and as enemy of the people, and what impact that's having on the institution. When I covered the state capitol in Sacramento, it was perfectly normal to have an adversarial relationship between us reporters and the administration or lawmakers, but this is something really completely different and not something I've seen before. Interesting that just today a new LA Times USC Dornsife poll came out, and it found that a slim majority of those who'd responded said they think the president is just venting when he says enemy of the people, but that slim majority also thought that kind of talk could actually engender violence towards the media. Is that accurate? Is that fair? What's your assessment, Lauren?
Well, I think that if you are a woman and or a person of color who writes about things on the internet, things have been pretty tough for you since long before Trump became president and started talking about the press. So that toxicity, particularly racial and gender toxicity, has been there for a long time, and it is exacerbated by a president who calls us the enemy. But I think it's important to to look at this like entire environment, and Donald Trump is in many ways a part of it. He is not it, and it's a big, large problem that won't go away when he goes away. And so I think that he wouldn't be able to erode the trust in the press like this if there wasn't already just a deep underlying problem.
Jan, let me have you respond to that as well. What's been the impact?
I think Trump's modus operandi is to instill anger and hate in his particular support group, and I think that he doesn't just make people mad at the media. He makes them mad at football players. He makes them mad at immigrants, and I think that journalism and journalists are really out of their comfort zone when it comes to dealing with rage. We don't know how to deal with rage. We tend to dismiss it and say, oh, those people are kooks, or we don't really have to pay attention for them because their opinions don't really count. We're really not good at giving, or we'll go out and sort of find a few people who are angry and say, well, we've given their side of the story. But I don't think we do a good job of figuring out how to cover both the rage that Trump generates and the rage that's in a response to that. We're just out of our comfort zone. But yes, I do think journalists are in danger. But the fact of the matter is, and as you've seen stories written, there are Trump administration officials that are in danger too, who have been yelled at in restaurants in Washington, D.C. when they try to go out to eat. So the whole culture is just bubbling up.
We've heard some brief mention here tonight about fake news, and there's been a lot of criticism of Facebook and Twitter and so forth for posting phony stories and spreading stories that are flawed or simply incorrect. How much of the blame belongs to the social media companies is the media not putting enough blame on itself for the spread of that inaccurate information? Martin, do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I know that there is one resource that I think folks should look to that is seeking to address this, which is the Trust Project out of the Markula Center for Applied Ethics in Santa Clara. It's being led by Sally Lehrman, who's a longtime journalist who had worked and did a bunch of research really internationally looking at what are the indicators of trustworthy content on news. And they're rolling out a series of those indicators, and that news organizations have been involved from the inception to illustrate what those indicators are of more information about who the reporters are, more information about their expertise, a better sense of having diverse voices on staff is another indicator. So there's 8 indicators of trustworthy content. And platforms like Facebook and Google and Bing are committing to rolling those out. And one of the key components of that is transparency and really being open about where this information is coming from. So I think folks should look up the Trust Project and get some information about it. I think it's a really important project to help articulate what is trustworthy online. And I think it's good that these platforms themselves are participating and contributing. There's also the News Integrity Initiative that is focusing on this, that's funded by Facebook. But that's a $14 million grant, which is certainly helpful that that Facebook funded the News Integrity Initiative that is then also helping to support other programs. But I think there needs to be, considering the fact that these platforms greatly benefit from the original reporting of many news organizations, I think they need to do a lot more to help ensure that their platforms are provide clean and clear and transparent information for the consumers that they seek to serve.
And speaking of consumers, what responsibility do consumers bear for making sure that the information they do consume and perhaps spread or pass on to their friends online, that information is accurate, that they're not just passing on bad information? What responsibility do consumers have? Should there be more consumer education about that?
Let me give
David?
a slightly unpopular answer for this room, which is to say that that we want to blame social media, but for the most part, what is spread online is, well, not news, but for the rest of it, a lot of it is mainstream news. So those people who are exposed to fringe fake news are generally already in an extreme bubble. It's not being exposed to marginal voters for the most part. It's not really the type of stuff that is affecting elections on the kind of on the margin. And so it is, news literacy and work around trustworthiness is extremely important, and it's stuff that we should be pushing heavily. But ultimately, it is the mainstream media that it is being consumed, if at all, on the social media sites. And so it is definitely just something to remind us that. And when it comes to kind of putting it on the consumers, one of the things that is tough is that at the end of the day, news literacy is a very expensive way to do it versus on the kind of demand side versus on the supply side. There's a lot of people, they're very busy, they're going to see headlines. It's very tough for them to break through details about what they're seeing. And this goes to why false equivalency is very dangerous, because people don't have time to discern this from that. It's like they're going to believe things they see. And so it's important that we think about solving these problems on the supply side, on the news side. That's an easier way to hit this.
I think we were just confronted with a really interesting example where USA Today, one of the largest papers in the country, ran on its op-ed page an op-ed from Donald Trump. And in it, no surprise, there were numerous misstatements of fact. And, their attitude is, well, we open up our op-ed page to all points of view. But it was provably wrong, and when there was an outcry in the journalism world that they should have fact-checked the op-ed before they ran it, they fact-checked it several days later and reported on what was wrong about it. But the fact of the matter is that the link that would be shared on social media was a link to the original op-ed piece. Rarely is the link shared to the truth squatting that's done or the fact-checking that's done. And I think again and again, journalists are in a position of reporting on page one things that really being stenographers. I mean, just echoing what is said, and then the fact checkers come back on page 8A to report the truth of what was said. And I think that's a really very dangerous paradigm, and I think people aren't seeing as many of the fact checks as we'd like them to see.
Well, beyond being more careful with content, what are some of the other ideas, if you will, for dealing with this issue of lack of trust of the media? Marvin Kalb, veteran broadcaster, has written a new book called Enemy of the People. And he says that Trump's attack on the media undermines the heart of democracy, and he says he's actually changed his mind on whether or not the media should remain objective in its reportings, that perhaps the media should take a stance. Seems like there's a lot of pitfalls when you start talking about that, but I'm interested in the group's thoughts.
Well, maybe I could weigh in on it. It's definitely related to that, to what you just said, but also the lack of trust, I guess, in certain media. I think, and I've just, from my reporting and from people that I've spoken with, even my own family members, they read usually what they know they're going to agree with. That's just going to back up their core beliefs. And I think that that's very difficult to contend with. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people, for instance, other fellow journalists who cover immigration, and about doing like a kind of an explainer on how difficult it is to come to this country legally, and how it can take decades for people from certain countries. I'm just giving you that as an example because that's what I know. But I feel like we've done that in the media. We've explained it several times in different forms, and I think that my belief is that people tune out to things that they will not back up their core beliefs. And I don't know if there have been any studies done on that. I don't know if you have anything to weigh in on when it comes to that, but I just feel like that's something that I've been confronted with a lot.
And let me ask you, has this issue of lack of trust or people only viewing what they want to view, has it changed your fundamental approach to storytelling at all?
Well, the kinds of storytelling that I like to do is more of embedded narrative journalism, not so much the policy analysis. And I like to add that kind of human angle because I think that people can relate to that. And I'll give an example. I did a story about this unaccompanied minor who came from Guatemala. His name was Gaspar Marcos. And it was a story about 19 hours of following him from when, this boy is an orphan. He has no one really in the States, and he basically rents a room in this place in LA. And it was a story of following him from when he goes to school all day, then has to literally run to catch a bus to work in the bowels of a West LA restaurant, and then collapses at 3 or 4 in the morning and has to do it all over again the next day. And the way we pitched that story on Facebook had nothing to do with immigration. Actually, it was something like school all day, full day of work, have to do it all over again the next day. And I thought it was very smart to pitch it that way, at least on Facebook, because it didn't mention immigration at all. And I feel like sometimes when you mention immigration, people just automatically tune out and they don't want to even read about it. But it was just a very human way of telling a story. And we got an amazing amount of traffic on that story. The story went viral. And people from I got emails. Usually I get really hateful emails when I cover immigration, but I got a whole gamut of emails, and most of them are actually really positive, and people who are for instance, I'm a Trump supporter, but I believe in strict immigration enforcement, but this kid, he deserves to be a US citizen. And I thought that was really interesting because it really humanized this abstract kind of phenomenon that can be really difficult to get your arms around, right? So that's how I approach stories, not so much from the policy angle, but from more of a human angle.
And Lauren, what about the storytelling?
Yeah, I think, our approach is different. It's a different one, but I think that I think Jan was talking about the rage. There's so much rage. People are so angry. In many cases, they have a right to be angry and terrified. And, when Vox is at its best, what we're trying to do is break through that And a story might come down on one side or another, but what we're trying to do is provide a sober look at what is actually happening. What's the context behind this argument, and what is the context behind this argument, and why people feel the way they do, and what's the policy that caused people to feel this way. And what we're almost trying to do is like get readers and viewers and our listeners to kind of stop and step back and think about what's really happening and sort of break through some of the screaming and shouting to get to the real context. And we find that, we get emails like Cindy was talking about where it was like, I didn't agree with the conclusion of this, but this was a fair article. This was a fair look at
That's awesome.
at what's really happening
That's what
here.
you want.
And I'm going to read you, or I'm going to come back to Vox, because I think that the way that you're approaching this is not making me feel bad about my opinions. And that's I think one way, even if a thing that's happening is objectively wrong, to break it down in a way that people really understand the argument and it's not just shouting is something that we really try to do, and it tends to really resonate.
I think journalists are at a point in time when we have to figure out whether we want to be a commodity or a catalyst. Whether we want to be a product that's sold and sold for as much money as we can get for it, or whether we want to be an impetus for change in society. If you want to be an impetus for change in society, you have to really create on-ramps in your journalism to allow people to participate in whatever you want to change. And I think that already we are starting to see in some of the entrepreneurial corners of journalism now, new models, new taxonomies of journalism that are starting to emerge that, to be quite honest, are very different than what Hayes would have taught you in journalism school. They're very different than what you usually teach. There are things like restorative narratives that help communities deal with problems. There's dialogue journalism. There's solutions journalism. There's activist journalism. There's even advocacy journalism, which is a scarlet letter word, but some of the activist journalism that's happening is really quite effective. And I think that when you look at what's happening with some of the startups like the Marshall Project, which very much advocates for social justice, or ProPublica, which in many ways in its coverage advocates for responsible health coverage, health care, and affordable, fairly priced health care. We're starting to see strains of this emerge. There's still an autopilot knee-jerk reaction in the journalism world to doing anything but a he said, she said kind of paradigm. And I think what we're seeing is that research shows that when you do a journalism that focuses on oppositional behavior, you really kind of trigger oppositional behavior in the community at large.
So I would put something in perspective. I would say that undermining institutions is an important part of what the Trump administration is doing well beyond journalism. Obviously, going after the FBI and going after other government services has been part of what they do. And what people say in surveys is not very clearly correlated with how they're behaving, in the sense that people are saying they're not trusting these things, but they're demonstrating a general still trust of the FBI, the general still trust of the media, in the sense that they're consuming it in certain patterns, and certain types of people are still consuming it in ways, especially the mainstream media. And Donald Trump himself still quotes the same institutions that the day before he says is garbage. And what that does is that leads people to believe, in some contexts, as you were saying earlier, that he doesn't really mean it and they don't really mean it, although over time it becomes more important. One thing that's clear is that playing into these attacks just further instigates more attacks and further undermines it. And so kind of letting those attacks go, and you can see that in those institutions that have played towards these attacks and tried to demonstrate their objectivity to the people who are attacking them versus ones that have kind of stepped back and just kind of let those brush off. But I want to give props to Vox and other news organizations and to remind people that what Vox does was considered ridiculous a few years ago. They do deep explainers, data-oriented, in-depth about policy. And so it's a reminder that there's still, as much as the marketplace seems scary and inefficient and falling apart, that there's innovation that can succeed wildly within a few years, and that there's open spaces for people to go and really make a huge difference in actually educating people and earning money.
I second that.
Very nice. There has been some talk in the past about whether or not journalists should pursue some kind of an official certification to kind of send a signal that they are mainstream or professional journalists as opposed to a hobbyist or something. And the idea in the past has always been sort of resisted or rejected. Is there any value to that idea? Martin, what do you think?
I mean, that's what journalism school is for.
That's what Jim Hayes was for.
Yeah, I think journalism is a craft. It's something that certainly can be taught and practiced. I mean, in the work that we do, but we also understand that there are people who are non-traditional storytellers who have something really important to contribute to the conversation. One of the programs you mentioned that we run at the Maynard Institute is Voices, where we train residents to be storytellers, and we don't want to turn them into journalists because there is a very unique perspective that they bring to the conversations that are happening in their community. And the lack of local journalism, I think, organizations, these national organizations that we're talking about, obviously like Vox and others that do really important work, but where I see that to a certain extent journalism is eroding is at the local level. The communities, we look at a community like Oakland, where I used to work, used to have 50 reporters covering schools, covering politics, covering neighborhoods. And what is happening is a huge erosion of that capacity. And that is really, it's really difficult because it's those local outlets that really help to frame narratives around community and lift up issues and lift up communities and people who are so often left out of the conversation. And so so there are programs like City Bureau in Chicago that are teaching people how to deep dive and do documents. There's programs like ours where we focus on residents who can be storytellers and speak on behalf of their community. But we're not necessarily, as I mentioned, trying to turn them into journalists. We're teaching them the tenets of journalism, but letting them speak in a way that traditional journalists don't. And I also think that it's important to note that the lack of diversity in news organizations is a real problem here when we talk about connecting to communities who are often left out. And when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about looking across the fault lines of race, class, gender, generation, and geography. And it's critical for a news organization to understand, to have a staff that's reflective of that, but also to approach that from an editorial standpoint. Because if you look at stories across race, across class, across gender, generation, and geography, you're going to ask questions that you wouldn't ask. You're going to talk to people that you otherwise wouldn't talk to. And you're also going to, it's indemnifying yourself against your own bias. Because this notion about objective journalism, I don't really know what that is. Because we as human beings are not objective. What we need to be is fair, and what we need to be is balanced. And what we need to do is indemnify the journalism we do from our own biases. And training can help you do that.
And talk about the lack of diversity and the link between that and the lack of trust.
Well, I would say that, journalism, the Maynard Institute has been around since the 70s, focusing on the lack of diversity. Was really born out of the strife of the 1960s and the Kerner Commission report, which turned 50 this year, that said that the media was really complicit at the time of its inability to articulate the stress and strife. It's interesting. If you read the Kerner Commission report now, it sounds like now, even though it's 50 years ago. And the lack of diversity, here we are still hovering around 16% of diversity across mainstream newsrooms across the country. And the AS&E, which is the American Society of News Editors, has an annual census where it assesses the level of diversity in news organizations. And this year it actually had to delay the releasing of those results because so few news organizations participated. Only about 200 out of 1,700 participated. And statistically, the statistics man would know this, that's not a way for you to actually get a sense of what diversity is like. The reality is the lack of diversity is a huge problem. And there was talk about credibility that Cindy had mentioned, which is that there are news organizations that are credible in many communities, and many of them are ethnic media. The problem is they're undercapitalized and under-resourced. So in my view, mainstream news organizations could learn a lot from what ethnic media organizations do, which is build trust. But the lack of diversity in newsrooms at various levels, from rank and file to managers, is a huge problem, because if you don't have diversity, then you don't have diversity of thought, you don't have diversity of perspective, and you don't necessarily have the ability to connect to communities that you otherwise would be able to.
Lauren, did you want to address the issue?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to the certification, I think, is a terrible idea. Just because of what he was just saying, there are so many barriers to entry to journalism already. To put up another one is I think, a bad idea, because what we want is to bring more people into the fold, and adding, some sort of step there, I think, is not the thing to do. I also think that just this moment of incredible racist strife that we're experiencing very out loud. It's obviously not new in this country, but it's different in this moment in the way that it's being expressed and fought over, is the way that newsrooms feel so ill-equipped to cover it, feel lacking in the language to talk about what's going on, speaks to the need for more diverse newsrooms, where, it seems like reporters can't even find the words for what's happening. You hear so much about racially charged things and racially tinged, and I don't know what that means. Like, I'm racially tinged. I don't know. Like, what is that? And it's a fear of using the big R word, but it's also a fear of really, like, describing what's happening in our country and what's been happening in our country for a long, long time. And finding that language and being able to write about it honestly is an important part of working our way through this, and can't really do that with newsrooms that aren't diverse.
Cindy, did you want to weigh in on that, since that's kind of your beat, is working on immigration issues? And
Yes, and especially I feel like we need more diversity when it comes to management and the people who are the decision makers, who are deciding what's going to go on the front page of whatever newspaper, right? And I think a lot of that comes, and we spoke a little bit about it over dinner, is about pay equity. And we at the Los Angeles Times, we've unionized now, and the Guild did a pay study on the LA Times, and it was very disheartening. I mean, you saw that, you would see, according to the pay study, that you had people of color and women who were proportionately severely underpaid compared to their white male counterparts. And I think we all kind of knew that this was happening, but to have hard evidence of it was really daunting and was very disheartening. And I think that that's something that really needs to be addressed, and not just at the Los Angeles Times, but throughout our industry, because who's going to want to work in an industry where they don't feel valued? And we need more people of color working in the media, and people of different backgrounds. Otherwise, how are we going to cover our communities accurately? And I think pay has a lot to do with it, and I think that also finding our voice as journalists and standing up for other journalists, which we have been doing at the Los Angeles Times as part of the Guild, is very important. For a long time, I feel like we've been taught to just, you know what, just be lucky you have a job in journalism. And bullshit. I'm sorry, but I am tired of that sort of conversation, that rhetoric. No, I have value. I speak Spanish. I'm a person of color. I'm a woman. I bring a different perspective. I deserve to be paid as much as my white male counterpart. And I think that to be able to say that for a long time was very taboo. And I feel like we're finding that voice. at the Guild, at the Los Angeles Times, and I'm hoping that other news organizations will as well, because otherwise I think we're all going to suffer, especially the readers. So that's my rant.
Let's talk about some other ways in which improvements to journalism are being pursued. And Jan, I know the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has been trying to engage audience by soliciting input from audiences about what it is they're interested in consuming. Tell me about the importance of that and how has that been working?
You know, I actually just did a column this week about, I don't know how many of you listen to 1A, the Joshua Johnson program in the morning. And they're actually in the whatever 20 months they've been on the air, they're catching on very quickly. And when you analyze what they're doing, they, instead of talking about how many places you can listen to them, they talk about how many ways you can talk to them. And they have about 7 different on-ramps that people can call in, tell their stories, text their stories, do a digital voice app that does a studio quality recording of their stories. You can go on the website. And they assert, and I think it's true, that the input they're getting from their audiences helps inform their coverage in very meaningful ways. And it helps with the pacing of their shows because they're not waiting for a call-in caller who's kind of stumbling over a story and it takes a long time to tell. They can kind of, you know, pre-edit whatever voice they're going to use on the story. So I think we're starting to see some efforts at opening engagement on-ramps that help people talk to the media. But at the same time, if you look at the Washington Press Corps, there's still a lot of press corps that covers press conferences by watching it on the television. And not really getting a sense of being out in the community. So, you know, I think there are tools out there to change things. I think there has to be some bandwidth and some emphasis on using the tools to really listen to what people are saying and to really understand, as Lauren was saying, the language of what they're saying and what the definition of words means to your audience as opposed to what you think the definition of a word means. Then that would go farther to improving trust than any kind of a certificate.
Something that I think is something that I've been thinking about a lot and thinking about different ways to implement at Vox is this idea that it's very easy for someone to label something fake news if reporters haven't shown their work. You know, like people who aren't in the industry don't know that like somebody is on the phone all day talking to people and, you know, reading the full paper from start to finish and out on the street and doing all of these things. It doesn't always make it into the piece. It informs, you know, your writing of it, but people don't understand how much work you're doing to get to where you are. And I think that finding different ways for the audience to understand the work that you're doing to create this product is, I think, something that might help to foster a little bit more trust. I'm really excited about this. We've partnered with YouTube Originals for a show that we're launching next year that will crowdsource questions, deep burning questions from the audience that will then investigate and answer for them. And I think that that's sort of along those lines of trying to help people understand how we come to these final products.
Well, there are a lot of other changes being discussed or pursued beyond just content, and that's how to deliver the news. So I know, for example, podcasts are big. There's more emphasis on video storytelling. Tell me about what Vox is doing in that regard.
Vox is doing all the things. One thing that I think is special about Vox is that we have like a pretty simple core mission, which is explain the news. And the cool thing about that is you can do that in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. and not everyone reads their news. Some people want to watch it on YouTube or watch it on a TV show, or they want to listen to a podcast, or they want to just read a Twitter thread about it, or watch an Instagram story. And what we're trying to do is to bring that mission, meet people where they are. I think audio is really one of the most interesting and intimate kind of ways to do that. And I think Cindy was talking about meeting one of her critics in person, and he kind of changed his mind about her and her work. And I think audio and podcasts is a sort of like intimate sort of experience. You have someone like in your ear talking to you, and it's not rehearsed, and you can take them with you in the car, and I think that fosters a different kind of relationship with the reporter, and I think it's just a really special medium that has a lot of promise in this area.
Can I add that I think the New York Times and with their podcast, The Daily, I think that's phenomenal. It's great because it really synthesizes the news, but it goes in deep into one topic or one issue. And I think that that's the way to go for a lot of newspapers. The Daily's great. If you haven't listened to The Daily, it's wonderful.
And I also think that it revealed here's one for the Center for Investigative Reporting, which was at one point really a legacy organization, deep dive investigative organization, and some years ago started the show Reveal, which is hosted by Al Letson, sort of created a podcast and radio show that now is on 450 NPR stations across the country, sort of taking the deep dive investigative work and translating it into this other, as Lauren talked about, this sort of intimate connection with readers and listeners. And the other part that's exciting that's happening at CR is also this film piece, this building out of this documentary film, taking sort of the investigative work that you're doing and thinking how can you also then do documentaries as well. So you've got these text pieces, you've got this podcast and radio show, you've got a documentary piece, and then also thinking about then how do you tell these various stories across various platforms? How do you connect with an audience? And the other part that I think that's key here as we talk about connecting is this investment that people who consume news need to have in what they are consuming. Right? NPR has done this with its membership, but now more news organizations like CR, like Center for Public Integrity, and others are working with News Revenue Hub to build membership models. And this notion that there should be a relationship between the news organization that's providing you information and the news organization that is and the community that is consuming it. And I think that there's something a relationship that can grow there, and opportunities not only for revenue, but also a deeper understanding and a deeper connection that goes beyond just a daily relationship.
And David, is there any research out there that talks about consumption of news and what people are looking for going ahead?
Yeah, well, so first, always to remember, it's funny, well, first of all, it's funny to hear Lauren describing essentially radio as like this revolutionary thing, because it's now podcasts. But like we've had that for a while where people talk into your ear and you feel like they're in your house, and FDR did it, and that's all back now, right?
It's got a new name, though.
Yeah, it does have a new name. And people still consume a lot of TV, right? So when it comes to what people hear, and there's still 15 million people a night, listen to the evening news. You still have millions of people watching the morning shows, and so it's fun to get to engage with a lot of these things. But I think the most important thing that you were touching on the end is the revolution that's going to happen, which is that web, which is web and all mobile and all these things, which are clearly going to be important moving forward, were introduced as teasers, and we introduced them as free. And that is basically something that is not sustainable, and I think people realize that. And it doesn't need to be like this forever just because it was. Plenty of things are introduced for free, and then people change their understanding of it, and you move to a world in which they suddenly have an expectation that they're going to pay for these types of things. And whether or not it's that the people subscribe more to digital like they used to subscribe to the newspapers, or whether or not we move to a system more of micropayments where you pay a very small amount of money per articles that you end up reading, there are a lot of people who are trying to learn how this is gonna be, and there's a lot of different innovation around it. But it's definitely, I don't think that you need to worry that the idea that people are used to free means that they're not going to ever get used to the idea that they start paying for things. It's happened before with many other mediums. We were just talking at dinner again about TV, right? TV used to be free. Everyone got TV for free, and then all of a sudden you started dropping $100 a month for TV, and people got really used to that. It's the way things happen. And so, and then the second part I would say is that where you were talking, there is this element of subscriptions and loyalty that people have been spending a lot of time thinking about, and this is really important. And so it's interesting where you have the membership model from NPR, you have subscribers for different newspapers. There's a sense of ownership that comes with a lot of this, a sense of loyalty, even if it's small amounts, and that it actually makes people read more and consume more. And so there's a lot of innovative stuff that can go with this, but it does seem that there are things that will happen in the future that will definitely seem obvious, and right now it just seems scary, but there are places to go.
Well, that marks a good transition to a discussion of how do you ensure that journalism continues to prosper financially. Any of us who worked in journalism don't like to think of the profession this way, but it is business, and as we all know, the business model has really shifted and eroded over time as the old advertiser-based concept has really slipped. So we're seeing lots of examples of new models. We've got wealthy, public-spirited owners, like the new owner of the Los Angeles Times, who are buying papers. The Washington Post is another example. Cindy, give us an idea of how, it's early yet, I know, but give us an idea of how it's going with a new public-spirited owner who says he wants to do the right thing as far as LA journalism.
Yeah, I think what Patrick says, he says a lot of really great things, and I'm cautiously optimistic. But he's also said that he does want to make a profit on the paper. He is a businessman, so I think we have to keep that in mind. I really think it's too early to tell. I'm hoping that what he says is what he really means, and if what he says is what he means, then I think we'll be in a good place. But I don't think we can just rely on billionaires, and not all of them are going to have good intentions, and I'm sure that some are going to have agenda. So that we have to be really careful with that. I don't think there are saviors necessarily.
I work with a lot of media startups, and what we're really seeing in this world is a lot of micro streams of revenue. There won't be one big sugar daddy that sort of pays all the bills. Or advertising is pretty much gone. It's pretty much been sucked up by Google and Facebook. But I do think that there are some creative streams of revenue that are emerging, and some are not so new. If you look at somebody like the Texas Tribune, they're bringing in $1.8 million a year in events alone, and they have people like Walmart and the University of Texas and all the energy companies in Texas supporting their events. I think that this whole question of whether you do subscriptions or a membership really speaks to the model of journalism, because if you're looking for members, you're looking for people to not buy a product, you're looking for people who want to support your mission. So you have to have a clearly articulated mission there. I think sponsored content, where people pay for editorial-like content, but it's not really journalism, still continues to be strong. I think there are a lot of underwriters for daily newsletters that are being recruited and for podcasts that are happening. I think that there are databases that are being crunched, and sometimes crunched on a consulting basis by news organizations. There are just really kind of very clever, intriguing places you can find for revenue, but you have to have someone being creative enough to do it.
Another part that I think is interesting too is sort of the advent of the philanthropic support of many news organizations. I mean, some years ago there was one of the first endowed reporting beats was funded by the California Endowment to focus on narrative change around health issues and disparities in communities. And at the time, it was something that was very novel, and journalists were very uncomfortable with it. But now, that's happening, and money is being given to for-profit organizations to fund specific reporting beats. So I think that's interesting. The philanthropic community, there's many nonprofit news organizations like the Center for Public Integrity, like Center for Investigative Reporting, who make a large chunk of their money through this. Those are not the large for-profit entities. But I think that there is also something to be concerned about, and Jan had mentioned this also at dinner, and I work for a company, which is hedge funds and equity funds owning news organizations. I mean, I work for a company, a Bay Area News Group, which was owned by Digital First Media, which is owned by Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund that has cut and stripped and took away an enormous capacity of local journalism. I think that's a real concern, and something that when we make the argument, or shouldn't argument, when we make the case for why it's important for consumers to support news organizations, it's because, in my view, there's a number of things that shouldn't be about unbridled profit, right? Healthcare, housing, education, prisons, art, and journalism. And I'm not saying that they can't be profitable, but I think that there's something that's really unsettling and concerning about hedge funds and owning news organizations, because they're not making decisions that are journalistic. They're looking to the next quarter and making cuts to staffs that are seeking to serve communities in a way. And even archives are being sold off as commodities. And what are archives and newspapers in particular? They're the history of a community. So it's something that I think is that should be of great concern to folks, particularly in local communities.
Well, and Texas Tribune was mentioned as one example of a digital startup. Another one here in California is Cal Matters in Sacramento, and it is a digital newsroom that is primarily supported by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. So what happens when that entrepreneurial money dries up? What happens then?
Well, I think that Jan was saying earlier about the micro streams is really important. Like Vox Media has a business licensing at CMS and recently licensed with Chicago Sun-Times. And I think that this is a time to really be thoughtful and creative and realistic about the business and find ways to make business outside of what have been the traditional ways and outside of just relying on a rich person to come along.
Or relying on a philanthropy to come along, because philanthropic interest will last about 3 years before funder moves on to their next favorite thing. So you really can't expect a very long runway there. And I think it's a matter of constantly rethinking what your opportunities are. But I also think communities have to ante up. I mean, and sometimes communities don't really understand. I know when the little site in Davidson, North Carolina was going under, the community says, oh, but you can't. We'll give you $20,000, you know. Well, the annual operating budget was like, you know, $220,000. Not a lot, but $20,000 wasn't going to fix the problem. You know, you really have to understand what it costs, bare bones minimum, to run these operations. And so I think citizens have to educate themselves, or we have to educate you a little more in terms of what the real costs are of gathering and verifying and collecting the news and disseminating it.
And to the earlier point on hedge funds, I'm not a fan of what hedge funds have done, but the fact is that the assets were there and they took them because no one else was going to buy them at that price. And what happened in Philadelphia, they bought the Inquirer for apparently a price that was like less than the building that they sold. And I'm not sure how the company got to that point, and that includes the Philadelphia Daily News and other places that Alden and other companies have bought. But the bottom line is that they were relying on classified ads. They went to Craigslist, then those went on to Facebook and onto Google and others, and basically they let themselves become a bloated asset. And mood lighting. But at the end of the day, this is not something that I think journalists can solve. This is something that the management who are still there really need to address. It's too much.
We're all about transparency here. That's right. Well, there was some mention earlier about community support. I think, Jan, you mentioned this. There's been some idea of marketing around journalism as something that should be supported by the public as a public service. It's very high-minded. I know that Peter Hartleb says that that's what they've been talking about to a degree at the Chronicle. How practical is that?
Well, there's some experimental efforts going on right now to create kind of a community commons where journalism is almost like a public utility, and it would be supported as such by the community. You know, whether that's going to fly or not, who knows. But I think there is sentiment in the community for support if you are doing good journalism, if you are doing something that people value and it's authentic and it's connecting with you. I think people will open their pocketbooks. The trick is that if you sell a membership, people think they buy a membership and it's forever. And the reality is you buy a membership and it's for 1 year, and you have to renew it again and again and again every year. And the news organizations have to be in people's face to renew it again and again every year. So we don't like to ask people for money, but the truth of the matter is that's what has to be done. So.
In what industry gives away, and this is to David's point earlier, I mean, what industry gives away its product for free? I don't know who does that. It's sort of our desire to rush to meet where we needed to be in the digital space just led us to just go crazy and make some terrible decisions. And I'm heartened by his notion that it doesn't have to be that way. But there's certain different things. I mean, the music industry had this issue. Obviously, the movie industry had this issue. But it feels to me that there's the democratization of the internet. There isn't a spigot in the way that the other industries were able to control their information in a way that the cable information, in the way that film has been able to. It feels like sometimes that it's just so hard to be able to sort of put that genie back in the bottle because of the breadth of outlets. Like, I was one who for a long time when I was in newspapers felt like there should actually be collusion, good collusion on the part of newspapers to finally say, wait a minute, let's all, because there's this sort of inherent competition, and so we didn't really want to work together because journalists don't know how to play well together.
That's right.
And so I think that lack of sort of collective mission in a certain way, maybe there's one CMS that we all use and everything flows through. I mean, that doesn't exist, and I don't ever see that happening. So it's almost like in order to sort of monetize all of this information, individual folks have to do it, when in fact, you could argue the most effective way would have been sort of collectively. And I don't know how we would ever get to that at this point.
And we all heard the outcry about paywalls early on, and it's become much more accepted by folks to the point.
I have a paywall. I get pissed off all the time with it. And I'm like, why is this happening? I paid this already. It's like.
The Wall Street Journal, really.
They do. And it doesn't always work. I'm like, I paid. Why can't I see this?
Right.
But to Cindy's point, I mean, the philanthropists went into the New York Times and Washington Post, and they made them profitable, seriously profitable, and that's.
Why do you call them philanthropists?
Sorry, they went in with an idea that they were. It wasn't clear that they were going into what Bezos was doing at the Washington Post looked a lot like he was doing as a charity project, but then he spent a lot of money and he made a lot of money, or he's making money, and that's the goal in the LA Times, and I think that needs to be the goal. And as you were saying, there's not an endless supply of rich people to come in and fix the problem. It needs to be done in a way in which it's sustainable.
So there's an example of a committed consumer right there and a supporter.
There was only one person raised their hand.
It's painless for you, but do you know that most public radio stations spend 30% of their annual operating budget seeking donations and seeking memberships? It's hugely expensive to do that.
We want to leave a few minutes for audience Q&A, but let me wrap up at least this part of the discussion by talking to each one of you about where you see journalism going. I mean, I am hoping that you see some hopeful solutions down the road, that this has not just been a discussion about the problems and the challenges and the headaches associated with journalism, but what kind of hope do you see down the road for the industry, and especially as we have a lot of young journalism students here in the room who are interested in pursuing this as a career? I'm interested in your thoughts, and Lauren, we'll start with you in the middle.
Yeah, I think something that I think about a lot and talk about a lot is this idea that I think that the idea of what objectivity means is shifting in a way that I think will encourage more women and people of color to join this industry. That, you know, I don't have this like black woman suit that I like unzip when I step into the office and then like put back on. Like this is part of my identity, and it's what I bring to work every day, and that has value and meaning. And it's actually a good thing that I bring that to work, and when I bring that to my editing and story assigning, it's not a bad thing. And for a long time, it just was sort of perceived that that was a liability instead of an asset. And I think that that's really changing in mainstream journalism. And I think it's going to change the way that people's stories are told and change the way that people feel about staying in this business for the long haul.
Cindy?
I don't know. I mean, I'm going to be frank with you. I'm in the trenches. I'm not making those decisions. I'd like to hear what he has to say, actually.
But do you have any, let me ask you this, do you have any regrets about pursuing this as a career?
Oh, not at all.
Tell me why.
No,
Tell me
not at
why.
all. I love what I do. I feel so blessed that I get to do what I do, and I really can't see myself doing anything else. I mean, we'll see. But I'm going to ride this roller coaster as long as I can because I love what I do.
I think that people will look back, and I have a lot of concerns about journalism, both in how much they've educated people recently and their businesses. But you look at 2017 and 2018, and I see journalism acting in such a noble manner in the sense of the democracy is facing a very serious crisis, that the checks and balances have fallen very heavily towards journalism in many of the crises that we've seen in the last few years, in the last 2 years, and whether or not journalism brought it on, which I can argue they did, they have responded to the crisis in many ways, and I think that is something that people look back on with a lot of pride and will motivate people for generations. And I also think that disruption is very, very hard. And disruption in industries over time a lot of times leads to the destruction of industries. So as we move from manufacturing into service industries, as we moved previously from agriculture into manufacturing, right? These things happen and they're gone. That will not happen with journalism. It is something that will endure, and it will just endure in different ways. And so you may not recognize the jobs that journalists have in 25 or 50 years, but they will have jobs because they're very important. It's just they will get paid in different ways, and that's just the way we'll be. And so it'll be frustrating to older journalists, but it will evolve, and that's where we're here to see.
I agree that disruption leads often to the end of an industry, and I think we saw that with Kodak cameras. You see that with Blockbuster videos. You know, again and again we see with the old IBM. We see it with Bethlehem Steel. We've seen it again and again, and I think that we are going to see a lot of newspapers go under before all is said and done. And I think a lot of them will be metro dailies, who are a very endangered species because they They're no longer covering local news. They're no longer covering international news very often. And they cover a lot of sports, occasional investigative pieces, and then they cover maybe their own city, but not the suburbs. I mean, they have their portfolio is really not designed enough to really support what they do. I think we're going to see many more smaller news outlets, things like Vox, or Vox itself has like 7 or 8 verticals, Vox Media, that are going to be informing us in different ways. They'll inform us about sports, they'll inform us about healthcare, they'll inform us about food and culture, they'll inform us about public affairs and government, but they won't all necessarily come as one mass merchandised product anymore. And it'll be up to us to decide what we want and what we want to support. And I think that public media will be very interesting, but I think as more and more of these media startups are pursuing the same membership model that public media has always pursued, there's going to be much more competition for those membership dollars. And it'll be interesting to see who wins out in that. And I predict that you'll see a lot more of your public radio stations developing more of a local news program instead of running the national syndicated NPR programs.
Martin, you hopeful about journalism?
Well, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because, to Cindy's point, I think journalism is the one profession where you go into a newsroom and you never know what you're going to uncover. So I think if I'm a young person, if I was a parent paying for my child to go to journalism school, I don't know how I would feel about that. But as a journalist, I think we don't get into this business to be rich. We get it because we love it. So in that regard, I think if you love something, then there's always a reason to be hopeful. There's a couple points, though, that I do want to make, is that I do wonder how artificial intelligence is going to play out in all of this and how cryptocurrency is going to play out as it relates to news organizations. It's Amy Webb scares the hell out of everybody every year at the night journalism symposium, whatever hell it is, and I go home and lose sleep and hair, and I have no hair, hearing about how that all of a sudden, that AI is going to take over the role of journalists. I don't believe that, but I do think that rather than waiting for what the opportunities lie, I think journalists who are Luddites most often, we need to get ahead of that rather than behind it. So I think that's an opportunity. The other one I do think is Jan's point. I think I'm most concerned about local journalism. I think the New York Times, Washington Post, these national organizations, Vox, AP, although it's not really a consumer outfit, but more of a membership organization. I think many of the national, Mother Jones and others, they have benefited from the Trump bump, quite frankly. That could subside later on, but I think there's a resurgence there. The concern I really have is the local journalism capacity, because it's communities of color in particular, those who are not the ones that advertisers traditionally want, and so many local news organizations don't have the internal capacity to have vibrant engagement staffs that are going out connecting to community, or even really understand to a great degree the value of that membership model. And to Jan's point, the cost of doing that is so challenging. But I'll end on a hopeful note around particularly investigative journalism. There are a number of programs that are in place now that are giving rise to more investigative journalists of diverse backgrounds. There's the Ida B. Wells Society, Ida B. Wells Fellowships, there's the FIJ, there's also the Reveal Investigative Fellowships. And so there's a number of fellowship programs targeting investigative journalists where they are, whether they're freelance or working for news organizations, getting them to really inspire them to stay in journalism by building their investigative skill set. So I think building the next generation and empowering what this country is going to look like, which is more diverse, and having those folks stay within journalism will provide an opportunity to have stories that more reflect society, connect with society, because in my view, if you don't have diversity, you don't have trust, you don't have credibility.
Thank you. Well, I know with this smart audience, we've got to have a few questions that may want to be posed to the panel. And so we have somebody here in the back. And who's got the microphone? Should I just use this microphone? Thomas? Okay.
I am a subscriber to the Los Angeles Digital Edition. It's a great one. I'm also I'm here for the Cal Poly KCPR weekend, 50 years. I was there 50 years ago. Yeah. I'm glad that the paper unionized, and I think that there was a great opportunity to applaud at that point, so we should applaud for the union at the LA Times. By the way, the Pew organization found that 3 times more conservatives online will defriend somebody because of their political views than a liberal. So that's an interesting point. We talked a lot about finance. I want to go a little bit darker if I can. This year has been a bad year for journalists in regards to danger. We see the Saudi New York Times columnists. We know about Russia and the Philippines, Mexico. U.S. is importing or exporting fake news meme. So I wonder, what is it that you think we need to look out for in regards to things like libel laws and things like that? But what do we have to look out for to protect the journalists? I mean, it's one thing for financing, but it's another on the actual attack on the people and on the institution and the First Amendment. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
You know, that's a tough question. I know that some news organizations are starting to invest heavily in fairly high-priced security experts, both to protect not only their foreign correspondents, but their national correspondents, and to protect their cyber operations, to be sure they're not hacked or they're not the data that they're collecting on their customers is not being used for nefarious purposes. But I don't think that's a very easy question, and it's dangerous.
The one thing, I worked on a project, the Chauncey Bailey Project, which sought to uncover who had killed the last American journalist before Don Bowles had been killed back in the 70s. So America's been a pretty safe country for journalists over its history, unlike Mexico, unlike the Philippines and other places. But I do think it's pretty alarming to have the person who holds the highest office in the land calling journalists the enemy of the people. And so to Jan's point, support the Committee to Protect Journalists would be one approach, because they're very vigilant in that regard, primarily focusing on, obviously, international. But I think it is something to be concerned about, and it's something that residents of this, and I don't want to just say citizens, but residents of this nation should ask themselves, is that appropriate, right? Because journalists seek to hold truth to power. And if we didn't have the Fourth Estate, what would that mean? We would be a dictatorship. We would be something that our current commander-in-chief seems to align himself with, and what he commends and in the dictators that he extols, their virtues. I think that's a problem. I think that's problematic. And I think journalists need to stand up and to speak loudly and articulate our value to communities, to our society. And even whether it's conservative media, whether it's whatever side of it is, it doesn't matter. The point is that a free press is one of the foundations of our nation and what makes it special. We should not forget that. We should embrace that. And it doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Independent, Democrat. It matters, and it's what set this country apart.
Question here in the front. Is my mic on? Here. Try this.
I'm not a journalist. I'm an English teacher. Yay, Oxford, comma. One thing that's troubled me lately is like the USA Today op-ed piece that was written by Trump or somebody who wrote for Trump. How are journalists responsible for the credibility of what they are publishing? If you are interviewing someone and what they are saying is patently false. I mean, I know you want to be balanced and you want to get both sides of the story, and I know how that works, but if someone says to you something that is patently false, as a journalist, what is your responsibility?
You know, I think we've seen more than ever these last 2 years, news organizations being willing to call out a lie, or at least say it's untrue if they don't want to use the L word. And that's not ever really happened before. We've never really had to do that so much before as we've done now. But it's never a very comfortable position to be in.
And calling something a lie doesn't really help if you've published the thing, right? So there's a lot of research that goes into this, but if you print something that someone says and then say it's not true, more people are going to believe that that thing actually exists than if you just didn't print it at all. And so actually putting qualifiers is not that helpful. And so this is very tricky for journalists, but they have to learn not to print these things. And if you do need to print them, you need to print them way down. You need to start with an explainer of the truth and have the reason why, the motivating factor down below, because people read from the top to the bottom. Most people don't make it down there, but you simply, the more you reprint things, the more people believe those things, regardless of how you qualify them. It just doesn't work.
We have a question right here.
Hi. I just retired from the newspaper after 35 years, and I've always believed that the truth to power, but I'm actually having a really hard time, given the fact that investigative journalism has been amazing under this administration. Bob Woodward and Bernstein brought down a presidency in Watergate during that. But now I'm wondering, where's the outrage after the New York Times investigative report on the Trump tax fraud? I don't understand where the outrage is and why citizens in this country aren't outraged about what's happening in this country. If this had happened under, if this had happened under Obama, he would have been crucified by now. And yet, nothing seems to be happening despite investigative reports. Oh, so the question is basically, where are we with truth to power? I've always believed that truth wins out, but I'm actually really disappointed lately.
There's no lever, so Congress is doing nothing, and so they're having no investigations, and so there's basically nothing that can be pulled, and so I think the people who are trying to make something of it are pushing their energies towards the 2018 election, where if that is where basically truth can speak to power when it comes to questions about corruption. And the other thing is with Donald Trump's corruption, obviously, or in the administration, is there is a fatigue, and there's a lot of it. And one of the things the media did during 2016, I think, is that they put out laundry lists rather than focus in on a few things. And this is where I think these questions about narrative come in. It's very hard for people to start parsing when there's just so many things. Once you narrow down on a very few things and build a kind of more concrete narrative, it makes it easier for people to actually hold on to it. It just becomes just another data point that people see go past them at this point.
On that particular story, I was actually wearing an editor's hat. I was surprised at how the media collectively framed the story, and the frame, the general frame, the meta frame on the story was Trump wasn't really a self-made billionaire. You know, he had all this help from his father, and there was a tax dodge. But the narrative was always about he didn't do it himself. And I really wondered whether a more effective narrative on the story that would have connected better with readers was, you pay your taxes, but he doesn't. But that was not the master narrative of that story, and I didn't understand why.
I disagree with that, because Trump pushed in 2016 the idea, like, you're a smart guy, you don't pay taxes. Like, that was one of his things, was saying, I'm so smart, I figured out the system, I know the system. So, like, he considered that a badge of honor, the fact that he doesn't pay taxes.
I also, and this is terrible that this is true, but I think that story dropped in the middle of one of the most intense and attention-grabbing stories that we've experienced this year, which is which is saying a lot. You know, in a perfect world, audiences would have enough bandwidth to pay attention to a bunch of different things. But I think that, and I'm not, the Kavanaugh story was really important objectively, and I think that it just sort of drowned out this enormous investigation. I tend to think it's going to come back. That it's not, you know, it's not sort of the last we've heard about this. I think I just don't think the collective attention of the country could pay attention to that and Kavanaugh at the same time. So I really tend to think that like there's going to be a resurgence of this story.
I agree, and I think one of the things, focus on really great journalism coming from Adam Davis in The New Yorker and others on the financial crimes of the Trump organization, involving questions surrounding money laundering, but also questions about these with Russia and being compromised to Russia based off of different types of things that may or may not have happened, ties very closely into this tax fraud. And this is also his Achilles heel, because it's very hard to go after the president politically as much as the financial crimes, where essentially it could hurt him more directly.
Watergate era, there was actually a check and balance on the part of Congress, was there not? I mean, there was bipartisan effort to address this, you know, horrible crime, malfeasance on the part of the president, where in this situation now you have a Congress that's unwilling to do that, to David's point. So I think part of it is also, you would see journalism happen, then it would move the needle, right, in congressional circles, but that isn't happening, right? So it feels like nothing's happening, and that's because of what's happening with Congress. The problem that I'm a little bit concerned around is that all of the voter suppression and other things that have happened that are seeking to diminish the capacity for Congress to actually change and reflect our citizenry, right? So I'm a little concerned about that.
Back then, during Watergate, a lot of politicians actually liked each other. We're out of time, but if there is any other question, we'll take one more right over here.
I'm going to make a suggestion that be the symposium topic for next year. Because I don't think we're going to get to that.
We got another 90 minutes here, and we'll talk about that.
That's my suggestion.
Very good, very good. All right, unless anybody else wants to weigh in, okay. Thank you to the panel. Let me turn the program over to Peter Hartleb.
Hello. Thank you. One more hand for our panel and for Kevin Riggs. I come from the old days in San Luis Obispo when the Tribune was the Telegram Tribune. Don't know where the Telegram went. You could do a full lap around the campus here. Fremont Theater was showing movies. But one thing that stayed the same, and I was just really pleased to see it, is I talked to a lot of students today, and it felt like nothing had changed. And I know Jim Hayes, seeing all the students who were here, would be really pleased with that, and I think this event was in the spirit of him. So thank you all, and I know a lot of the students are going to the next event, but thank you all for coming. I want to thank a few people, or we want to thank a few people. The Jim Hayes Symposium sponsor, Sage Publishing. One more time for Cal State University Entertainment Alliance, the Cal Poly Journalism Endowment. We can withhold applause till the end. Cal Poly Career Services Diversity Funding Committee, Cal Poly College of Liberal Arts, Cal Poly Political Science Department, the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County, Randall Communications, the San Luis Obispo Tribune and New Times, Dreaming Tree Wines, Lagunitas Brewery, Slow Brew, Cassandra Shelburne, Thomas Morales, and all the journalism department staff, students, and faculty who worked to make this program a success. Mary Glick, department chair, and Claudia Buck, our advisory board chair. Everybody, the next event, it's not over. The next event, you're all invited to the KCPR benefit concert at Slow Brew Rock, kicking off KCPR's 50th anniversary celebration featuring Los Angeles pop band Sure Sure, The Charities, and Paperman. Tickets at the door, $20. All proceeds benefit Cal Poly student radio station KCPR. Hope to see you there. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, I thought it was a great event and appreciate everyone coming. Students, you can retrieve your golden ticket for attending this symposium for extra credit as you exit, and that's the end.